Good afternoon and welcome to our first lecture in the GSOE Dean's Speaker Series on Equity and Justice in Education, given by Dr. Mario Suarez. My name is Dan Tillepaw, and I serve as the Associate Dean for Equity, Outreach, and Faculty Development, and the Director of the Center for Educational Excellence and Equity within the Graduate School of Education at California Lutheran University. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge the lands on which we gather today. We acknowledge that California Lutheran University resides on the traditional territory of the Chumash people. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homelands. In their footsteps, we carry forward their tradition of coming together to grow as a community. We offer our respect to their elders and to all Chumash people, past, present, and future. I want to provide some key information for everyone before we get started. Today's talk is being recorded and it will be posted soon to our Center for Educational Excellence and Equity website as a helpful resource. At the end of today's talk, we will have an opportunity for you to ask some questions. We do ask that you reserve conversation in the chat just for your questions, which will be posed to Dr. Suarez at the end of his presentation. You can send those questions to me directly in the chat or post them publicly. Additionally, I want to extend my gratitude to the Division of Natural and Physical Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences, who have been co-sponsors of Dr. Suarez's talk today. I also want to recognize that Dr. Suarez's talk has been planned as a part of the GSOE's recognition of LGBTQ+ History Month, which is recognized each October on campus. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Mario Suarez. Dr. Suarez is an associate professor of cultural studies in the School of Teacher Education and Leadership at Utah State University. His research agenda is focused on the question, how does our understanding of gender and sexuality shape K-12 formal and informal educational spaces? We are lucky to have him join us today to share insights from his body of work, particularly his use of the U.S. Department of Education's high school longitudinal study of 2009, which was one of the first longitudinal studies to include gender and sexuality as items and was designed to study the STEM experiences of students and school level factors from ninth grade until college completion. I know that you likely join me in being excited to learn more about Dr. Suarez and his work, and at this time, I'll pass things over to Dr. Suarez.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much to you all for attending, and to Cal Lutheran University for hosting me virtually and inviting me to this talk. My name is Mario Suarez. The title of this talk is What Does Queering and Transing Have to Do in STEM K-16 Schooling Environments? And I'll be talking a little bit about insights from my own research. I use he, him, el pronouns, by the way. I'll give a little bit of an outline of what the presentation will be about. So I'll just kind of briefly gloss over some terms so that we're all on the same page. I'm not sure on folks' knowledge of queer and trans and other gender identity terms that we tend to use, and so I'll kind of go over that. I'll speak a little bit about my positionality as a researcher, and how I come into this field in this research. And then I'll get to the gist of the presentation, where I'll talk briefly about what it means to be queer and trans in STEM education, what the literature says, and then about gender and sexuality in STEM education. And finally, I'll spend the majority of the time, over a little bit over half an hour, I'm allotting to talking about two different studies, one of them which has been just recently published in AERA Open. It's called Exploring Queer and Trans Students' Math Identity in Relation to STEM as a White Cis Heteropatriarchal Space. I think it was just published about a month ago or so, and it's completely open access. So if you'd like to get a hold of that one, let me know, and I'm happy to send it over to you or point you to it. And then the second study is one that is still a work in progress. I'm hoping on finishing it up either later this semester or early next semester. And it's called Using Latent Profile Analysis to Explore the Portraits of Queer and Trans Types of Students. And then I'll end kind of a little bit of like kind of where are things headed and in the field and in terms of the research with queer and trans students in STEM. So some of the terms you'll see me using quite a bit. I use gender, but when I'm talking about gender, it refers to gender identity. I operationalize that as the self-determined gender. It can be the same or different as that is assigned at birth. Usually, it's medically assigned at birth by the doctor. Sex is the medical assignment at birth. Sexual orientation is how one identifies in relation to the gender of the person or persons that they are attracted to. And then I want to note that oftentimes in the literature, sexual orientation and gender identity are used interchangeably, or they might be used pretty commonly. And so I'd like to note that they are separate constructs, but they are sometimes related. So, for example, we might have individuals who identify as gay and trans and men, or they might be identifying as lesbian and trans and women. So they are related constructs for gender and sexuality. You'll also hear me speaking quite a bit using the terms like cis, that stands for cisgender, somebody whose gender identity aligns with their gender assigned at birth or the sex assigned at birth. Trans is somebody who's identified as transgender, so I'll use trans and transgender interchangeably. And then I'll use queer to refer to sexual orientation quite a bit, though the literature does talk about those as well. I also note that I use the high school longitudinal study in the studies that I'm working on or that I've worked on. And I'll note specifically that gender identity and sexual orientation was not specific items until 2016. So because this data set started data collection in 2009 when they were ninth graders, they were youth. They didn't start collecting gender and sexuality until 2016 when they were out of high school and they were already adults. So I'll note that I am denoting some or identifying somebody as queer or trans retrospectively aligning them that gender identity or sexual orientation, which can be difficult and important to note, and in part because the reason I do that is that regardless of the student's disclosure of their sexual orientation or gender identity, I argue that their experiences of systematic, institutional, interpersonal oppression are still relevant, and they're still felt when they are young, even if they did not identify as queer or trans themselves at that time. Um, in terms of my positionality, and I always talk about my positionality. There are a couple really great papers by one by David Gilborn and Wendy Castillo that specifically talks about including positionality statements in quantitative research, which is those of you who may be familiar with quantitative research is not very common. The reason I do that is because there is an inherent subjectivity, as I see it, in creating categories, or how you choose to collapse categories, and so on and so forth, and the types of analysis you choose to use, what variables you choose in your research. And so I identify as a quantitative criticalist, which basically means that I'm asserting that quantitative research can be a tool for social justice, as imperfect as it may be. Um, I'm a queer researcher. I'm also a transgender man of color. I have different levels of academic privilege, and so I recognize that I'm tenured. I just recently was tenured this last year. So I do hold a little bit more privilege in terms of academic freedom that I have. I'm a part of a group called the collaborative called Queer and Trans People of Education, which is in education, which is based out of University of Vermont, started by my dear friend and colleague Jay Garvey. About 3 years ago, I want to say, he asked me to be a co-principal investigator in this group, and uh, the idea behind it and the notion behind it is a way to kind of create a collaborative of like-minded individuals who want to use statistics for the betterment of the experiences of queer and trans people in education. I was also a high school mathematics teacher for nearly a decade in Texas. So this is my second career. Um, and 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 in all, I have an extreme commitment to enhancing the experiences and opportunities for queer and trans students in STEM education from pre-K all the way to the beginning years of college. So now I'll move on a little bit to the studying of gender and sexuality in STEM. So what the literature talks to us or tells us about it uh, with regards to the social construction of gender ability. So the last 50 years of the field of STEM education kind of has seen a little bit of an evolution. It started out as looking at mostly differences between boys and girls or men and women. And so in the last, couple of decades, it's kind of moved to a reconceptualization of how sexual orientation and gender identity shapes students' STEM experiences. Um, there's been a rise of feminist epistemologies that have paved the way for a research that explores gender disparities in math education, um, and specifically about queer students, not so much trans students, in the last couple of decades. And often that's been used to the argument that's been used to do that is to justify the diversification of STEM workforce. As a matter of fact, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but NSF just released a call for proposals, which was a dear colleague letter uh, on increasing research in of queer and trans students as a way to diversify the STEM workforce. And so there's several different programs within NSF that signed on to that as a way to be able to increase the number of proposals that attend to queer and trans identities in STEM. So most of it in that rise primarily focus on how boys outperform girls in STEM in different disciplines in STEM, and that the argument that was made was that there was a gap that needed to be narrowed or that needed to be closed. And Richard Gutierrez calls that gap gazing. So specifically just focusing on that gap to close it, not for any other reason, but just to close it. Um, as research on social construction of gender evolved in feminist studies, mostly through queer theorists and scholars, they have attributed gender disparities in STEM to what is called the masculinization of STEM. And this is some work by Luis Leiva and others that call this refer to this as the male superiority myth. And so um, basically in the past it was deemed as in the past and to some extent now it's still specifically who was deemed as capable in STEM in comparison to others is socially constructed as inherently male and cisgender, able-bodied, and so on. Um, and so that's one of the things to keep note of as the social construction of gender ability was. Now I'll move on a little bit to queer and trans students' high school experiences before talking a little bit about this is the overall high school experiences before moving on specifically to what it means like for STEM. Some of the latest numbers from 2020 from the Williams Institute give us an idea as to how many youth identify as queer or trans. And so the Williams Institute estimates that about 9.5% of youth ages 13 to 17. I worked on a systematic literature review that was published about a year ago, where I looked at why is it that we mostly only have data on queer and trans youth, usually about starting around age 12 or 13. And the truth to that, and then one of the things I found was that specifically there's no surveys out there that gather demographics on youth for so many different reasons, but a good chunk of them is because IRB issues with collecting data from minors. They are a vulnerable population, and so uh, it's difficult to find and challenging. It can get difficult and challenging to do that in cases specifically where we might have queer and trans identified students, and they might be in a scenario where their parents might not be supportive. Therefore not allowing them to take part in some of these research studies or data collection. So that's kind of one of the background of why we see approximately 9.5% of youth ages 13 to 17. Um, One of the things that we also know about is that definitely school climate is a big factor in student outcomes, educational outcomes in school, in their health and in their well-being. And this all comes from some of the past research that GLSEN Research Institute has done. There's two types of kind of school practices that they kind of summarize it into unsupportive and supportive school practices. And unsupported can be anywhere from bullying, not speaking out, teachers who are not supportive, or admin who is not supportive, administration that has poor policies or no policies with regards to queer and trans students. And so they found that unsupportive school practices can be detrimental specifically. They're about 3 times more likely to be consistently absent, have lower GPAs, about twice as likely not to matriculate into college, discipline in school, have lower self-esteem, and higher levels of depression. However, there's a little bit of a buffer, right? And opposite effect that can occur when we do have supportive school practices. So if we have, curriculum that reflects their gender and sexuality, or if we have good school policies, the students report, queer and trans students report that they've heard that anti-queer and trans remarks to administrators. They feel safer, they have lower levels of victimization, fewer absences, less depression, higher self-esteem, overall better well-being and mental health in those cases. So this is kind of like the big picture of what it looks like for queer and trans students in high school. So as you can kind of picture it, that it's already starting the funnel, so to speak, right? The pipeline to STEM is kind of decreasing a little bit. And so those that do end up in one, going to college, and then two, going into STEM, are a small group of that larger population for so many different reasons. Um, so the literature in for queer and trans students in STEM, in large part, kind of focuses a good chunk in post-secondary education. So we know quite a bit about what it is like to be a college student who is queer, trans, in STEM education. We don't know a lot about what it means to be a queer or trans student interested in STEM, or just good at STEM in pre-K to 12th grade, um, uh, uh, for a lot of that. Um, Research that addresses STEM engagement, self-efficacy, academic achievement among queer and trans studies primarily focuses much more on higher education, like I mentioned. Among college students, those who aspire to major in STEM, queer and trans students are less likely than their heterosexual peers to complete a STEM degree. And this is some work by Bryce Hughes. John Freeman attributed the lack of representation of queer and trans people in STEM to their experiences of discrimination and bias in the field. And then also isolation from dominant STEM culture. Uh, uh, Miller and others kind of talk a little bit about this, and they mention that there's this heterosexist cultural norms, the masculinity, right? the neutrality in STEM fields that isolate queer and trans individuals. And so Leva, like I mentioned, and others call this a STEM as a white cis heteropatriarchal space. Although these studies are focused on collegiate environments, they kind of give us an idea on some of the contextual factors within STEM that play a role in the educational experiences of queer and trans high school students. One of the themes that run through that research uh, is that there's primarily heteronormative, cisnormative nature of STEM, as well as this gatekeeping ability of math courses. For example, Leva found that math achievement was usually assessed quantitatively and engaged in a binary operationalization of gender, which often tends to privilege white cis heterosexual males. This was echoed later on by others, and they asserted that diversifying in STEM, the diversity in STEM typically focuses on improving access for heterosexual and cisgender women. In exploring STEM learning environments, there was Fisher, who found that queer and trans students experience positive math identity development through supportive spaces such as a gay straight alliance or queer student alliance or queer, so as they're called, GSAs or QSAs, and that supportive teachers and schooling environments and extracurricular support can be very helpful to kind of improve their math identity. Um, Research shown that affirming queer and trans students' queer identity is related to a strong math identity. And that's helpful information to note because it having a strong, it's been documented that having a strong math identity is important to be able to continue on into STEM. So that could be, taking advanced mathematics courses and matriculating into the STEM field. Um, I mentioned early on that there's this kind of inherent neutrality of STEM, and so there's been several researchers that have kind of called to disrupt that and as a way to kind of make STEM more inclusive, not just of cis heterosexual men, but of everyone. I'll dig a little bit deeper into this framework that I've used quite a bit, and I use also for the first study that I'll be talking about, and operationalize it for you based on Leva's work. So the way he explains it is that there's three dimensions that explain kind of this dynamics at play in STEM education. And so he calls it the institutional dimension, the ideological dimension, and the relational dimension. So the institutional dimension focuses on kind of these institutional factors, right? These organizational structures, barriers, so policies, school climate that are kind of the reason that they produce unequal or equal STEM access for minoritized students, and so much more so for those that sit at different intersections. So queer, trans students of color, or those with disabilities, undocumented students, and so on. There's an ideological dimension that looks at those kind of invisible norms, right? So this notion of positivism, neutrality, and all these behaviors that are prevalent that are not always spoken about and taught. And then the relational dimension, which are the different students' reactions or actions that they take to the experiences that they have that are oppressive in STEM. So it's sort of like the coping strategies that they use to kind of navigate those oftentimes hostile experiences. So in terms of the sample studies, like I mentioned, I'm gonna give you all talk about two different ones. I'll talk briefly about the deeper things, the background knowledge. So, with regards to the way I view data and the way I carry out statistical analysis, um, like I mentioned, I'm a quantitative curriculist or I subscribe to quantitative curriculism. And there's a tension specifically between one being a quantitative methodologist, and then also kind of with my background in queer and trans studies. There's this tension in part because um, the queer and trans theory kind of resists categorization, resists, boxing up your identities, right? And so by using quantitative methods, oftentimes we have to do that. But so I navigate this kind of tension in between. So when I do the research that I do and the work that I do, I try to be as transparent as I can, not just with my positionality, but also with the work that I'm trying to do, and for what reasons. And quantitative criticalism was kind of higher education was kind of popularized by Francis Stage. And basically what it means is that somebody who's a quantitative criticalist seeks to expose and critique systemic inequalities that arise from either how data is collected, analyzed, interpreted. And there's this quote in his paper from 2007 that I really appreciate that says the quantitative criticalist seeks to forge challenges, eliminate conflict, and develop critique through quantitative methods in an effort to move theory, knowledge, and policy to a higher plane. So that's kind of like the background that I bring into in the analytical lens that I bring to the research. As Dan mentioned, I've been using the high school longitudinal study of 2009 for, I want to say, about 3 years now. There is a public access data set, but the public access data set does not have access to a lot of the variables that I am interested in, like gender and sexuality, for example. So I have the restricted data license for the first 4 waves, and then I'm in the process of obtaining the 2021 post-secondary education administrative records, which has basically, up to completion of these ninth graders. So I've been approved for it. I just haven't received it yet. It usually takes about a month or so to receive it, and they'll send it in like a CD format. So it's a stratified two-stage random sample of students from across the United States. So what that means basically is they randomly selected schools from across the nation. And then out of those schools, they randomly selected ninth graders within those schools from there. And so the final sample in the data set is about 24,000 students, just a little bit under. These are all ninth graders from across the United States. And the 4 data collections that I have access to are the base year, which was collected in 2009, right? Ninth graders, we have access to that. We have also access to teacher data. I have access to administrator data, counselor data, and parents as well. There was a follow-up in 2012, around the time that they were 11th graders. So for the first study that I'll talk about, I used the base year and the follow-up. There's a 2013, and that one was basically all the high school transcripts that gives us information on SAT scores, PSAT scores, ACT. Gives information um, on a host of other things like how many courses they took, what advanced courses they had, and so on, AP courses and stuff like that. And then the 2016 data set was the second follow-up. And by then they were already starting or had already started maybe in the middle of college. One of the things that I want to note is that it's one of this survey is one of the first ones to collect sexual orientation and gender identity as a result of some conversations that were had, way before then with the Department of Education. And so if you're interested in using it, I highly recommend it. It's a great, very robust data set. It was designed to look at and increase the diversity basically in STEM. And so Not only does it have sexual orientation and gender identity, it also has a couple of other variables in there that might be that relate to minoritized identities. In terms of identifying the way I operationalize queer and trans students, I use two questions from the 2016 data collection. So the first one is, do you think of yourself as, and then they ask the options that they have are lesbian or gay, that is homosexual, straight, that is heterosexual, bisexual, don't know, or another sexual orientation. So anybody who identifies as anything other than straight, I operationalize that as somebody who identifies as queer. And the reason I do that is because those students who that might don't know, I argue is that who chose that they don't know, I argue that they um, might not have had the language to either one come out or understand their sexuality, but they did not pick straight or heterosexual, right? For a reason. Um, and then with regards to gender identity, they were asked, what is your gender? And then they give them a definition. So your gender is how you feel inside and can be the same or different than your biological or birth sex. And the options that they gave them were male, female, transgender, male to female, transgender, female to male, gender queer, or gender nonconforming, or some other gender, or unsure. And so similarly, anybody who was not um, specifically male or female was identified as somebody who's trans. Um, and again in this study, I operationalized trans as anybody who was not cisgender. So that could include, non-binary, genderqueer individuals, non-conforming, and so on, and those who are questioning as well. So the final sample of students for the first study, I do compare queer and trans to cisgender individuals, so you can get a sense for these. By the way, all the sample sizes that I'm showing to you are around to the nearest 10. That's one of the guidelines that the Department of Education Institute for Educational Sciences has. Uh, uh, and for queer and trans students, there are maybe about 1,600 or so students. Students who identify specifically out of those queer and trans students who identified as heterosexual, there were about 60. So trans individuals who identified as heterosexual. Those who were LGB, there were about a little bit over 1,500. Those who identified as cisgender, there were about 1,340. And those specifically just as trans were about 260. The sample is majority white, about 50%, and then there's other, anywhere from 9% to about 16% of other minoritized individuals. There are others, but I just didn't include them in this slide because they're too small. But I have them in the complete demographics and the percentages in the full paper. And then primarily most of these queer students were female identified, so about 58%, a little bit over 58%. So given that context, the first study is like I mentioned, the one that was just published in AERA Open, was I explored queer and trans students' mathematics identity in relation to STEM as a white cis heteropatriarchal space. So I operationalized based on the data that I had and the variables that I had access to, operationalize these three dimensions that I spoke to you earlier on from Leiva's paper. So there were two research questions in that paper. I looked at differences in mathematics identity related experiences and perceptions. So all of what really that means is I looked at the dimensions of that framework of Leiva's framework, the STEM as a white cis heteropatriarchal space, and I compared it for differences by sexual orientation and gender identity for high school students. So that was specifically just from ninth grade. And then the second question I wanted to look at, to what extent are these dimensions of this framework that I just mentioned, this Leiva framework, relate to their math identity in high school students from in the difference between wave one and wave two. So whether it increased or decreased their math identity from ninth grade to 11th grade. Again, also by sexual orientation and gender identity. Other than the gender and sexuality items that I use to operationalize gender and sexuality, I use a couple other variables, and so I'll briefly speak about them or present them to you. All the different scales that I use have already been created by the Department of Education, by the National Center for Ed Statistics, and they were operationalized using exploratory factor analyses for the first couple of scales. And then the other ones that I'll speak briefly on the other ones. The other ones were Likert type scales on a strongly disagree to strongly agree 4-point scale. So I use math identity scale. Again, that one was already created. School belonging scale, administrator's assessment of school climate, a self-efficacy scale for math, scale of students' interest in their ninth grade math course, a scale of students' school engagement. And then these last couple ones were the Likert type that are not scales at all. They're just Likert type items. So sees themselves as a math person, others see them as a math person, and then how to what extent they enjoy their ninth grade math course, to what extent they think math is a waste of time, their ninth grade math course is a waste of time, and then to what extent they think their ninth grade math course is useful for everyday life. And then I use, for the first research question, I use a MANOVA, multivariate analysis of variance, to look at the differences by gender and sexuality. And then I use ordinary least squares regression for the second question. There's an administrator's assessment of school climate in there, which is at the administrator level. So I ended up looking at intra-class correlations to see if I needed to do some kind of multi-level analysis. And ICC was the intra-class correlation was very small, so I just kept it and continued on with the ordinary least squares regression. Let me see the next one. Oh, okay. So I'll go briefly over the results. And I have all of this in tables if you want to see them in later on as well, or I can send you the papers like I mentioned. So some of the important things that came from and the interesting findings that came from this is that queer students reported significantly lower sense of belonging. They also reported lower levels of having school climate, or their administrator reported lower levels of school climate. They were less likely to see themselves as a math person. They were less likely to be interested in ninth grade math courses, had lower levels of school engagement, and they were less likely to enjoy their ninth grade math class and think that it was not a waste of time. So this is very similar to what's out there in terms of like the post-secondary research, very, very similar, but it's one of the first times that we've seen it happen in a K-12 context quantitatively. We had similar results for trans students' math identity. In particular, strong institutional and relational dimensions from that white STEM as a white cis heteropatriarchal space were associated with higher levels of math identity. That's specifically noteworthy as this specific study shows evidence that that ideological dimension might not be significantly related to queer and trans students' math identity, which places greater emphasis and greater focus on systemic issues of math, specifically the relational and the institutional dimension. And like I mentioned, this is really interesting because these findings align with and support others' empirical findings in post-secondary education. I also did some other analysis. So the second research question with the regression analysis, they highlighted that the specific roles that the ideological and relational dimensions played in queer and trans students' math identities in 11th grade, and so or in the growth from ninth through 11th grade, from wave one to wave two. In particular, school engagement showed great promise for queer and trans students' math identity, as one of the things we saw was that these students had a greater they had the greatest levels or the highest levels of math identity when they reported the highest levels of higher levels of school engagement. And we attributed that to a greater sense of the students' internal identity and the pride that may be reflected at that time in an increase in school engagement. And there's other research that have kind of talked a little bit about this, not it was specific to sexual orientation or gender identity, but there's others who have talked a lot about this with regards to positive ethnic or racial identity, for example, and how school engagement increases when they see higher levels of positive ethnic or racial identity. Um, it's also important to know that this finding is meaningful because school engagement and social connectedness have been shown to be predictors of academic achievement and student well-being. So those are one of the things that we found as well. Another noteworthy finding was that of trans students' positive relationship between math identity and wave two, and their perception that their ninth grade math course was useful for everyday life, which one of the things we found was that it wasn't significant for any of the other groups. We attributed this to the societal attempt to invalidate trans identity, and thus, if trans students see some utility to everyday life in math, they may perceive it as math, quote unquote, seeing them, right? Because they're not always or often seen. So it's one that I think it's an interesting finding and that I think merits further research, particularly maybe in a qualitative sense. Um, One of the other things that we also found was that Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander queer and trans students had the highest math identity ratings in 11th grade, not only just compared to other white students, but across the board compared to like everybody. And we found positive effects that were found across all levels of ANAPI sexual and gender identities, though they were larger for queer and trans students. And this is also important to note because research shows that many Asian students feel pressure to meet this quote unquote model minority myth or stereotype that's specifically in mathematics. And this may be a case to do further study qualitatively to see what are the nuances that are playing a role in this happening for queer and trans ANAPI students. So that was the first one. The second one, like I mentioned, is a little bit of a work in progress. I've been working on this study for a little bit less than a year, trying to get it to a better spot, and then also kind of a little bit less than a year. I was on say about 8 months or so on and off, and trying to get it to a better place and to where I can continue on with a few other analysis after I look at the specific types of students. Or profiles of the students in STEM. Specifically with regards to quantitative criticalism, right? I want to note that these profiles, right, the latent profile analysis or latent class analysis, as some others use as well, they're meant to kind of guide STEM practitioners specifically, not to kind of stereotype or typecast students. I don't want to put students in a box, right, or in a profile specifically. I want it to be used as specific guidance for practitioners who might be able to find this information useful as they craft either interventions for their classes or lesson plans, type curriculum and so on. Um, and this particular analysis, because I'm only interested in queer and trans types of students, I do not use cisgender or heterosexual folks in this analysis. In part because I also think that queer and trans students are individuals worthy of studying on their own without having to have a comparison group all the time. So the research question for this study was what distinct profiles emerged from the science and math measures in the ninth grade? And I'll show you in a bit, I have a table to show you what are the scales that I use specifically for this study. Like I mentioned, it's a latent profile analysis, and I look at different fit indices to determine how many profiles to have. So I use a big in AIC, so a Bayesian information criterion and a Kaike information criterion. I use SSA big, log likelihood, and entropy, and all of these are done on Stata 17 and RStudio, and those are the two packages that I used. I also used analytical weights provided by the Department of Education. I used the wave one student weight. I also used the weights for the other analysis I just showed you all. I forgot what the weight title was, but I also used the weights for the other one as well. And why choose latent profile analysis? In part is because it's a person-centered approach rather than focusing on variables, as is, maybe most regression analyses tend to be variable centered. And Bauer specifically states that latent profile analysis is useful when the researcher aims to analyze categorical individual differences in terms of a classification of persons according to typical patterns of their characteristics or behavior, which I think fits in really nicely with queer theory and quantitative criticalist inclinations, in part because as you might see, um, some of the fit indices are kind of in between, a 3 profile or 4 profile or 5 profile solution. And so there's a little bit of an inherent subjectivity in there in choosing the profiles and then also in the naming of them as well. So these are the variables that I use. All of these are skills, again, created by the Department of Education using principal components analysis um, uh, factor analyses. And they were basically 4 different components or 4 different constructs. One of them is math, and then the other one science identity. So math utility and science utility, math self-efficacy and science self-efficacy, and then interest in their ninth grade math and science course. And I'll get to the solutions, the results. I have, again, tables and graphs if you'd like to see them as well. But I'll just be summarizing them for you. So after looking at different kinds of fit indices, I was trying to figure out, whether a 3 or 4 or 5 solution profile solution were best. I landed on 5 profile solution, in part because it gave more room for students to see themselves or for students' identities in terms of where they could potentially land and see themselves. So the first profile was about 13% of the queer trans students. Those students reported low math and science scores. So those were the students who did poorly on both or identified the lowest identity, lowest utility, lowest interest, lowest efficacy, and lowest in liking their math and science course. The second profile was specifically high in math identity, but it was low in math and science utility and interest. And then they were somewhere in the middle for math and science self-efficacy. And this was the smallest profile, it was about 4% of the students. The third profile, they had low mathematics, but then they were kind of in the middle or neutral in all the science scores and this was the largest profile, about 41% of the students. So low mathematics, and somewhere in the middle for science. Profile number four were high in everything, high mathematics and all the science scores. And those are about a quarter of the queer and trans students, which I think that in and of itself, it's kind of pretty interesting finding is that about a quarter of these queer and trans students um, really had high math and science scores in everything. And then the last profile were a little bit of neutral or somewhere in the middle in math, and low in all the science scores, and this was about 17% of the students. So I'll end with a few concluding thoughts, and then I'll leave us room for about half an hour or so of conversation with each other. Um, so all in all, from both of these studies, and then some of the other work that I've been part of and or either currently or continuing to be part of with this data set, I'm finding that these findings are indicative of larger systemic inequities that others in STEM have talked about and written about for about a decade, particularly as it relates to queer and trans individuals in STEM, from K-12 all the way to post-secondary. Um, it also gives us evidence to support that, or to know that affirming policies and school climates are important for queer and trans individuals, and we have, not a statistical evidence to show that. Um, we also have information, right, to to kind of um, help others, right, practitioners specifically, work to dispel and disband these invisible norms, right, that exist in STEM, this neutrality, this um, positivism. And in particular, the STEM profiles from the second study of queer and trans students may be helpful for teachers and counselors as they are able to identify interventions early on in ninth grade that can hopefully over the next couple of years help foster their STEM identities and STEM learning, in order to kind of increase that pipeline from ninth grade through secondary education. And that's all I have. I have all the references here if you'd like to see them. I'm have also happy to share this with Dan later on, so that way you all have access to it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Suarez. Before we move into the questions that folks might have, I'm in the chat. I'm going to send the AER Open article that was mentioned. I pulled that up as you've been speaking, Mario. So hopefully you don't
Oh
mind me
yeah,
sharing that.
yeah, not a
If
problem.
folks do have questions, you can feel free to take yourself off mute and ask anything, or if you'd rather, you're welcome to also share any questions in the chat, and we will talk through those.
There's also a couple other papers that I mentioned. I'm part of QT Pie, right, the Queer and Trans People in Education, and over the summers we have an emerging scholars program that uh, helps graduate students from across the nation who want to learn more about how to use um, quantitative methods, critical quantitative methods, to improve the outcomes of queer and trans people. And so, 2 summers ago, our focus was on STEM education, and so they got to present. They submitted a panel for AER this last AER in was it Chicago or wherever, yeah, wherever it was, Philadelphia. And so all of these graduate students, doctoral students, are in the process of having their paper either submitted for publication. One of them just submitted it for publication and got a revised and resubmit. So they a lot of it is coming from this data set as well. So there's a couple papers in the pipeline, all related to high school longitudinal study and STEM education.
maybe I'll jump in with a question if it's okay.
Please.
Sure.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about this large group with I think they were they were high on the science side and maybe not so much so on the math side. And I'm just wondering if that might be sort of a reflection of an interest in some of the areas of science that are maybe not as mathematical. And I know that when you sort of divide some of the STEM fields, um, the ones that are kind of more mathematical, physics, engineering, maybe computer science, those are also the ones that, with respect to women and minorities have always been poorer performing
Hmm.
in terms of their numbers. So I'm just wondering if that's something similar is kind of underneath that, if some of the preference for STEM might be some aspect of STEM, like biological sciences or earth sciences that have done better with, you know,
Yeah, that's a really great question. Um, Anecdotally, I mean, I was a high school math teacher, right? And I taught Algebra 1, which is at that time of the ninth grade, kind of coming in with like no advanced credits or anything. It's like everybody got thrown into Algebra 1, which is a very abstract, abstract discipline, right? An abstract subject. And so I think you're right. Yeah, it does show that a lot of these students might have more inclinations for um, uh, courses where there are more readily able to make the connections between that and the real world, right? I think is important. One of the things that I'm hoping to do is once I do get my hands on this pair data set, the post-secondary education access records, um, is that I will be able to see where they graduated, with what degree they graduated from, so to see whether, they did go into more of um, a mathematics or like more abstract STEM field, or a more like, openly real life, a relatable a STEM field. So that's kind of why I'm holding on to this for now, because I do want to get access to that data set before I submit it off for publication anywhere.
well, thank you.
Thank you.
I guess I'll go. I thank you so much for this talk. It's always really interesting to me as a lady physicist to sort of hear about how other people sort of are experiencing similar things. And so I guess my question is just, as college professors, how can we, do you have any like baseline suggestions for how we can make our department the most inclusive? And we've been thinking about it a little bit. We've been involved in the past in a sort of national program that's sort of overall just about inclusivity and belonging in physics and engineering. But if you have any suggestions that we could do, just let us, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things out of the that I know of. There are student organizations, like there's one called Out in STEM, right? That focuses on fostering their gender identity and sexuality in places with others like themselves, right? And they so not only do they have like university student groups, but they are also part of, like, they have a national conference that they have, right? So they're not only able to connect with other queer and trans students in STEM in their university, but also as part of like the larger, like college students in the nation and stuff, if they dare to go to the larger national conference. So and there's a couple others. I mean, the other things like making sure that, we respect pronoun use, names, all of that is important, right? Because it also kind of adds to the students not feeling isolated and feeling like they feel seen by their instructors and the professors. I mentioned Jay Garvey and I are part of that queer and trans students in education. I mean, queer and trans people in education collaborative. we collaborated with AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, on a 2-year study that we did of universities and colleges, along with their postdoc, Dolan, CB Dolan, who watch out for in the next couple of months, we'll have a report coming from it. So we looked at what practices are colleges and universities doing to foster sexual orientation and gender identity data collection and practices at their universities. And so we have data from several hundred universities across the U.S. to see what are queer and trans students kind of how are queer and trans students experiencing in STEM, right? Experiencing the policies and practices in their universities and how those relate across the board with other places and stuff. And so I won't talk too much about it because that specific project and that report is still kind of being edited literally as we speak and stuff. But it should come out later on this year, if not early in the spring. And I'm happy to share with you as well.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm in the math department. I'm Carolyn. And my question is kind of related to Mary's, but I had a slightly different take because I know you'd said there was a lot of work done at the college, university level. And so this is early studies on the high school. And I was wondering what, as a college faculty, we could take from a high school study. I mean, part of it is about what students coming in, what their experiences were. But a lot of it I see as this could be really useful for high school counselors and such to know. But there's got to be something we can pull out of it as well. And I wondered what you saw as that component of it.
Definitely. I definitely think there needs to be there's always all these recruitment programs, right? And like, day of STEM and stuff like that, that universities and colleges put together. And I think having specifically like events like that, but where it be events like or workshops like that are specific for queer and trans students or other minoritized identities, I think would be really helpful for high school teachers to know that those occur, so that way they can tell their students, but then also so that they can pair with other, like, let's say queer and trans students in college, right, as kind of mentorship programs and so on, like that. So that way these students in high school can see that they're not going to be alone, that there's going to be a space for them, in college once they go, if they choose to go into STEM. Because that's one of the things that I'm really looking forward to, that all these students that are in this data set is once I get their data about what they graduated with, what degree they graduated with, they did. I'm really interested in seeing where did they go? Like, did they go into like a humanities, liberal arts, or did they go into STEM? And if they went into STEM, what specific types of STEM disciplines did they go into?
And then my follow-up on yours, I was thinking, and I don't know if the data has it, but we've get the students who like go into biology because they want to be a medical doctor or something. That's their view of how to help people, but then they go out. So we see a lot of movement out of that into other fields, and some of them go into the sciences, other sciences, and some of them leave the sciences entirely. So I think it'd be really interesting if we had the data about what they started college as.
Yeah.
And then what they finished as.
And I do. The 2016 data set does have what they declared in 2016. And then the 2021 will have, what they graduated with. So that'll be really interesting to see, which is what I think what makes this kind of data set, this longitudinal study, such a gold mine, because you're able to answer so many different questions from a nationally representative group of students. So hopefully there will be others to join in on doing this research, and it's not just me and a few others. So that, because I already feel a little bit overwhelmed with some of all the different like projects that I have in the pipeline and stuff. Most of them tend to be with graduate students at this point now, which is great. That it can improve and increase their notoriety in their field as well.
Any final questions? Well, hearing none, thank you so much again for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Suarez, for your work and sharing these insights with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all. I really appreciate y'all coming.
Yeah.
You.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Have a good day.